What happens when the man who has everything is about to lose the one thing that ever mattered? Richard Davenport built an empire of glass and steel, but his heart is a fortress. He traded love for a younger model, a shinier prize. But tonight, in a restaurant where secrets are the main course, his two worlds collide. His pregnant ex-wife, the woman he left behind, collapses at his feet. It's not just a medical emergency. It's a reckoning, a story of betrayal, power, and the long, painful road to redemption. The restaurant, Aurelia, was a jewel box suspended 50 floors above the glittering chaos of Midtown Manhattan. It was Richard Davenport's kind of place, obscenely expensive, impeccably designed, and insulated from the gritty reality of the streets below. From their table, the city was a silent, sprawling tapestry of light, each pinprick a life he could buy and sell 1,000 times over. He swirled the deep crimson liquid in his glass, a 1982 Petrus that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The wine was a statement, just like the woman sitting across from him. Isabella Rossi was 24, a decade younger than the wife he'd just discarded. She was a piece of art, sculpted by ambition and good genetics, her skin glowing under the soft, strategic lighting. Her dress, a sliver of emerald silk, clung to her like a second skin, and her laughter was a carefully calibrated melody designed to enchant. She was talking about a gallery opening in Chelsea, her hands dancing in the air. But Richard was only half listening. He was watching the way the light caught the diamond necklace he'd bought her that afternoon, a constellation of perfect, cold stones. It was a transaction, like everything else in his life. He provided the lifestyle. She provided the illusion of youth and adoration. And the artist, he was just divine. Isabella sighed, her eyes wide with a practiced innocence that Richard found both amusing and pathetic. He said my energy was luminous. Can you imagine? I can, Richard said, his voice a low, smooth baritone that commanded boardrooms and bent politicians to his will. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. Her skin was cool. You light up any room you're in. It was a line, one he'd used before, but it worked. She blushed, a faint, becoming pink that rose on her cheeks. He had built his empire, Davenport Holdings, from nothing but a small inheritance and a predatory instinct for market weaknesses. He saw the world in terms of assets and liabilities, acquisitions and mergers. His marriage to Eleanor had, for a time, been his most valuable asset. She was class, old money, a graduate of Vassar with a quiet intelligence that had once grounded him. She had been the anchor to his soaring, ruthless ambition, but anchors, he'd decided, were meant to hold you down. He wanted to fly. Isabella was not an anchor. She was an ornament, beautiful and weightless. The waiter, a man whose deference was as starched as his collar, appeared at his elbow. Mr. Davenport, your Chateaubriand. Two servers placed the massive platter between them with practiced ceremony. The scent of rosemary and seared beef filled the air. It was a performance of opulence, and Richard was its star. He was about to lift his knife when a commotion near the entrance caught his eye. A woman was arguing with the maître d', her voice a low, urgent murmur that was just audible over the restaurant's hushed symphony of clinking silver and muted conversation. Richard's blood ran cold. He knew that posture, the determined set of her shoulders, the way she tilted her head when she was making a point she refused to concede. It was Eleanor. Isabella followed his gaze. "What is it?" she asked, a flicker of annoyance in her tone, an unwelcome interruption in their perfect evening. "Nothing," Richard said, too quickly. But it was too late. The maître d', a formidable man named Jean-Pierre, whose job was to protect the sanctity of this inner sanctum, was shaking his head. "I'm sorry, madam. but we are fully booked. And there is a dress code. Eleanor looked down at her simple maternity dress, a soft blue cotton that was a world away from the silks and satins of Aurelia's clientele. Her belly was a prominent, proud curve beneath the fabric. She was 7 months pregnant with his child, a child he had told her he didn't want. Not with her. Not anymore. "I'm not here to dine," Eleanor said, her voice trembling but clear. I need to speak to Richard Davenport. I know he's here." Jean-Pierre's eyes flickered towards Richard's table for a fraction of a second, a silent apology and a warning. The entire restaurant, it seemed, had gone quiet. The performance had a new star. Richard felt 100 pairs of eyes on him. He saw the whispers, the subtle turning of heads. This was the one thing his money couldn't control, a raw, human mess. He should have stood up, walked over, escorted her out before it escalated. But he was frozen, pinned to his velvet chair by a cocktail of shame and fury. Fury that she would dare to follow him here, to this place, and shame because he knew, deep down, that she had every right. "Richard!" Isabella's voice was sharp now, the illusion of adoration shattering. "Who is that?" Before he could answer, Eleanor pushed past the maitre d'. Her eyes scanned the room, wide and desperate, and then they found him. For a moment, the world seemed to shrink to the space between their two tables. He saw the hurt in her eyes, a deep, cavernous pain that his cruelty had carved. He saw the exhaustion, the dark circles that spoke of sleepless nights. And then he saw something else, a flicker of disbelief, a final, crumbling piece of hope turning to dust as she took in the scene. Him, the expensive wine, the beautiful young woman wearing diamonds that should have been hers. Her face went pale, a ghostly white under the warm lights. Her hand went to her belly, a protective, instinctual gesture. She opened her mouth to speak his name, but no sound came out. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and with a soft, sickening sigh, she crumpled to the floor. The sound of her body hitting the plush, expensive carpet was louder than a gunshot in the silent, gilded cage of Aurelia. The silence that followed Eleanor's collapse was a physical thing, a thick, heavy blanket that smothered the restaurant. It lasted only a second, but in that second, Richard Davenport's carefully constructed world fractured. The illusion of control, of power, of untouchable success shattered into 1,000,000 pieces on the Aubusson carpet. Then chaos erupted. A woman at a nearby table gasped, a shrill, piercing sound. A waiter dropped a tray of champagne flutes, the crash echoing the shattering of Richard's composure. People were standing up, craning their necks, their faces a mixture of shock, pity, and a morbid, undeniable curiosity. This was better than theatre. Isabella recoiled, pulling her hand back from Richard's as if he were suddenly contagious. "Oh my God," she whispered, her eyes fixed on Eleanor's still form. "Is she?" She couldn't finish the sentence. Her face, usually a mask of poised beauty, was now pale with genuine shock and a rising tide of anger. This was not part of the deal. The public humiliation, the messy, unpredictable drama of a spurned wife. It was vulgar. It was cheap. For a moment, Richard remained frozen. His mind, usually a sharp, analytical machine, was a maelstrom of conflicting impulses. Get her out of here. Call a doctor. Pretend you don't know her. Run. The last one was the most potent, the primal instinct to flee the disaster he had created, but he couldn't run. Not from this. Every eye in this room, a room filled with his peers, his rivals, the very people whose respect he'd spent a lifetime cultivating, was on him. He was no longer Richard Davenport, the titan of industry. He was just a man, caught in the glare of a spotlight he hadn't sought, with his pregnant ex-wife unconscious on the floor, and his mistress staring at him with accusation in her eyes. Jean-Pierre, the maître d'eau, was the first to regain his senses. He was at Eleanor's side in an instant, his professional calm a stark contrast to the surrounding panic. "Someone call 911, he commanded, his voice cutting through the noise. He loosened the collar of Eleanor's dress, his movements efficient and practiced. The command finally jolted Richard into action. He pushed his chair back so violently it nearly toppled over. He strode towards Eleanor, his long legs covering the distance in 3 quick strides. He knelt beside her, the expensive fabric of his Tom Ford suit bunching at the knees. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rough. He touched her shoulder, and her skin was clammy. Her face was ashen, her breathing shallow. The sight of her, so vulnerable and fragile, sent a spear of something sharp and unfamiliar through his chest. It wasn't pity. It was fear. A cold, terrifying fear that he had pushed her too far, that his callousness had done irreparable harm. "What did you do?" Isabella's voice was a hiss from behind him. She had followed him, and now stood hovering over the scene, her arms wrapped around herself. "Who is she, Richard? Tell me." He ignored her. His focus was entirely on the woman on the floor, the mother of his unborn child. He could feel the judgment of the room pressing in on him, the whispers growing louder. "That's Eleanor Davenport." The voice came from a table near the window. It was Marcus Thorne, a rival hedge fund manager who would relish this story. Or she was. Heard he left her a few months ago. "For her," another voice whispered, dripping with disdain. Richard's jaw tightened. He felt a surge of white-hot rage, not at them, but at himself. He had invited this. He had set the stage, cast the players, and written the script for his own public immolation. He had believed he was above consequences, that his wealth was a shield. But here, in the wreckage of his own making, he was just as exposed as anyone else. A young busboy, no older than 19, knelt on the other side of Eleanor with a glass of water, his face etched with concern. "Is she okay, sir?" he asked, looking at Richard with wide, earnest eyes. The boy's simple, human decency was a rebuke to Richard's own monstrous behavior. "An ambulance is on its way," Jean-Pierre announced, his phone pressed to his ear. "They say not to move her." Richard looked down at Eleanor's face. A stray strand of her honey-blonde hair had fallen across her cheek. He remembered twisting that same strand of hair around his finger on their first date, in a small, noisy Italian restaurant in the West Village that smelled of garlic and cheap red wine. He remembered the way she'd laughed, a genuine, uninhibited sound that had made him feel, for the first time in his life, like he was home. What had happened to that man? When had he traded that feeling for the cold, empty satisfaction of a Petrus and a diamond necklace? "Richard!" Isabella's voice was insistent, pulling him from the past. "This is a disaster. My publicist will kill me. Our reservation was under your name. This will be everywhere by morning." Her words, so nakedly self-serving, finally broke through his shock. He looked up at her, really looked at her, and for the first time he saw past the beauty. He saw the hard, calculating core. She wasn't worried about Eleanor. She wasn't even worried about him. She was worried about her brand. In that moment, the entire artifice of their relationship seemed pathetic. "Then maybe you should leave," he said, his voice flat and cold. Isabella stared at him, her mouth falling open. "What did you just say to me?" "I said, leave," he repeated, turning his attention back to Eleanor. "Get out of here, Isabella. This doesn't concern you." The paramedics arrived then, a whirlwind of blue uniforms and efficiency, parting the sea of onlookers. They took over, their voices calm and professional, asking questions Richard couldn't answer. "Is she on any medication? Does she have any pre-existing conditions? How far along is she? He just shook his head, feeling useless, a spectator at his own life's train wreck. They loaded Eleanor onto a gurney, her face small and pale against the white pillow. As they wheeled her towards the exit, her eyes fluttered open for a brief second. They met his, and in them he saw no anger, no hatred, just a profound, bottomless sorrow. Then she was gone. The restaurant was still buzzing. The spell was broken, but the story was just beginning. Richard stood alone in the center of the room, the Chateaubriand cooling on the table, the wine left untouched. He had never felt more alone, or more exposed. He had built his house of glass and steel, and now everyone could see the monster who lived inside. The air in the hospital was thick with the scent of antiseptic and quiet desperation. It was a smell Richard associated with weakness, a place where bodies and lives broke down. He hated it. He sat in a hard plastic chair in the waiting area of the maternity ward at Lenox Hill Hospital, a world away from the plush velvet of Aurelia. Here, the lighting was fluorescent and unforgiving, stripping away all pretense. It revealed the smudges on the linoleum floor, the weariness in the faces of the nurses, and the deep, gut-wrenching shame in his own soul. He had dismissed his driver and taken a cab, needing the anonymity of the city's yellow bloodstream. Isabella had called him 6 times. He'd ignored the first 5, and answered the 6th only to tell her, in no uncertain terms, that it was over. Her response had been a string of furious, venomous words. But he'd hung up before she could finish. The sound of her voice was like nails on a chalkboard to his raw nerves. A doctor, a woman with tired eyes and a kind face named Dr. Miller, had updated him an hour ago. Mrs. Davenport, Ms. Hayes, she had corrected herself, glancing at the chart, had a vasovagal syncope episode, a sudden drop in heart rate and blood pressure. It's not uncommon in pregnancy, often triggered by emotional distress. The doctor's gaze had been professional, but Richard felt the unspoken accusation. Emotional distress. He was the emotional distress. The baby? He had asked, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. The baby's heartbeat is strong, Dr. Miller had assured him. We're keeping her overnight for observation, just to be safe. She's awake now. You can see her if you like. He'd been sitting here ever since, trying to summon the courage to walk down the hall to her room. What could he possibly say? Sorry I'm a sociopath? My apologies for destroying your life and then flaunting my new, younger girlfriend in your face while you carry my child? There were no words for the magnitude of his failure. Finally, he stood up, his legs stiff. He walked down the corridor, his expensive leather shoes squeaking softly on the polished floor. Her room was at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open and stepped inside. Eleanor was propped up against a stack of pillows, a fetal heart monitor strapped to her belly, the steady, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of his child's heart filling the small room. She was staring out the window at the brick wall of the adjacent building, but her eyes were unfocused, lost in some middle distance. She looked pale and exhausted, but the terrifying fragility he'd seen on the restaurant floor was gone. In its place was a quiet, resolute strength that he had always admired and always underestimated. She didn't turn when he entered. "They said you were out here," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I told them to tell you to go home." "I couldn't," he said, his own voice sounding hollow in the sterile space. He stood awkwardly by the door, feeling like an intruder. "Why not?" She finally turned her head, and her eyes met his. They were the color of a stormy sea and just as turbulent. "Run out of people to impress for the night? Or did your date get tired of the floor show? The sarcasm was a shield, and he knew he deserved it. I told her to leave. It's over. A short, bitter laugh escaped her lips. Oh, is it? You mean this one didn't work out either? Don't worry, Richard. There's always a younger, prettier one waiting in the wings. There always is. Ellie, He took a step closer. I am so sorry. Sorry? She sat up straighter, the movement causing the monitor to beep faster. What exactly are you sorry for? Are you sorry for telling me you felt trapped in our marriage, a week after I told you I was pregnant? Are you sorry for having your lawyer send me divorce papers in a FedEx envelope, like I was a business deal you were closing? Or are you just sorry you got caught? Sorry that your perfect, curated life got a little messy in front of all your important friends? Each question was a blow, landing with pinpoint accuracy. He had no defense. All of it, he whispered, the admission costing him more than any deal he'd ever made. I'm sorry for all of it. She stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for something, a hint of the man she had married. The man who had once made her scrambled eggs on a Sunday morning and read the paper out loud to her. The man who had held her when her father died and promised he would never leave her. You know what the worst part is, Richard, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. The absolute worst part of all of this. It's that I almost believed you. When I found out I was pregnant, I was so happy. I thought, this will fix it. This will be the thing that reminds him of what we have, what we built. I thought it would bring you back. She shook her head, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. How stupid I was, to think a baby could fix something that you had already decided was broken. The steady thump, thump, thump of the heart monitor was the only sound. It was the sound of a life he had helped create, but had tried to reject. A life that was now inextricably linking him to this woman he had hurt so profoundly. I came to the restaurant because my health insurance was cancelled, she said, her voice regaining its strength. Your company sent me a letter, effective the 1st of the month, the day our divorce was finalized. Did you know that, Richard? Did you know you left your pregnant ex-wife without health insurance? He felt the blood drain from his face. He hadn't known. He had delegated the details of the divorce to his lawyers, told them to be generous, but to get it done quickly. He had never considered the practical, human consequences. The thought of her, pregnant and uninsured, trying to navigate the labyrinthine American healthcare system because of his negligence, made him feel physically ill. No, he said, his voice choked. I didn't know. I'll fix it. First thing in the morning, I'll call HR. I don't want you to fix it, she cut him off, her voice like ice. I don't want anything from you. I went to a legal aid society this afternoon. They're helping me apply for Medicaid. I will figure it out. On my own. The finality in her voice was absolute. She was closing a door he hadn't even realized was still open. He had spent the last 6 months systematically dismantling their life together, and now he was shocked to find himself standing in the rubble, alone. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as an extension of himself or as a problem to be managed, but as a woman, a person who was strong and resilient, and who was going to have this baby, with or without him. And in that moment, the magnitude of his loss hit him with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just the marriage he had lost. It was his humanity. Ellie, he began, but he didn't know what to say. Please leave, Richard, she said, turning to face the window again, presenting him with her back. I need to rest. And honestly, I can't stand the sight of you right now. The dismissal was quiet, but it was more profound than any shouting match. He stood there for another moment, a ghost in the room of a life he had thrown away. The sound of his child's heart beat a steady, relentless rhythm, a testament to the future he had almost destroyed. He turned and walked out of the room, the squeak of his shoes on the linoleum floor sounding like a retreat. Richard's penthouse apartment on Park Avenue was his fortress of solitude, a monument to his success. It was a space of clean lines, cold marble, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a god's-eye view of the city. It was designed to impress, to intimidate, to showcase a life of impeccable taste and immense wealth. Tonight, it felt like a tomb. He walked through the cavernous living room, the silence pressing in on him. The space was immaculate, thanks to a twice-daily cleaning service. Not a cushion was out of place. Not a speck of dust marred the gleaming surfaces. It was a sterile, lifeless perfection. He remembered when this apartment had been filled with the comfortable clutter of a shared life. Eleanor's books stacked on the coffee table, a half-finished crossword puzzle on the arm of the sofa, her favorite cashmere throat draped over a chair. She had brought warmth and life to this cold architectural space. Now it was just an expensive, empty box. He went to the bar, a sleek, backlit affair stocked with the finest liquors known to man. He poured himself a generous measure of Macallan 25, the amber liquid catching the light. He didn't bother with a glass, drinking straight from the crystal decanter. The whiskey burned a trail down his throat, a welcome, punishing heat. He wandered into the master bedroom. The king-sized bed was perfectly made, the sheets a crisp, hotel white. This was where he had slept with Isabella. He looked at the bed now and felt a wave of self-disgust. The encounters with her had been passionate, exciting, but utterly devoid of intimacy. It was a performance, a frantic, physical act designed to stave off the encroaching silence, the gnawing emptiness he felt in the quiet moments. It had never worked. His mind replayed the scene in the hospital room, Eleanor's words echoing in the vast emptiness of the penthouse. "I don't want anything from you." The finality of it, the quiet dignity with which she had severed their final connection. He had stripped her of her marriage, her home, and he'd just learned her health insurance. And yet, she had refused to be a victim. She was applying for Medicaid. She was finding a way without him. Her strength was a mirror that reflected his own profound weakness. He had told himself that leaving her was a necessary act of self-preservation. He'd felt suffocated, not by her, but by the life they had built. The dinner parties, the charity galas, the endless parade of social obligations. It had felt like a cage, and he had been rattling the bars for years. He'd convinced himself that what he wanted was freedom. The freedom to be with a woman like Isabella, who demanded nothing from him but his money. The freedom to live a life unburdened by emotional ties, by the messy, complicated business of love. But as he stood in the silent penthouse, the city lights glittering mockingly below, he realized he had never been more imprisoned. He was a prisoner of his own ego, his own ambition, his own cavernous loneliness. He had traded a life of substance for one of surfaces, and he was beginning to understand the catastrophic nature of that bargain. He walked over to a bookshelf, a custom-built mahogany unit that was mostly for show. But on the bottom shelf, tucked away behind a row of leather-bound classics, was a small, unassuming photo album. Eleanor had put it together years ago. He pulled it out, the worn leather feeling soft beneath his fingers. He opened it. The first picture was of their wedding day. They were standing on the steps of the New York Public Library, Eleanor radiant in a simple, elegant gown, her smile so wide it crinkled the corners of her eyes. He was looking at her, not the camera, a genuine, unguarded smile on his own face. He didn't recognize that man. He looked happy. He looked in love. He turned the page. A picture of them on their honeymoon in Amalfi, both of them sunburned and laughing, a half-eaten pizza on the table between them. Another of them decorating their first Christmas tree in this very apartment. Eleanor on his shoulders, trying to place the star on top. Page after page of a life he had systematically dismantled. A life that had been real and messy and beautiful. He came to the last photo they had taken together. It was from a year ago, at his company's annual gala. He was in a tuxedo, a tight, forced smile on his face. Eleanor was beside him, her smile equally strained. The space between them in the photo seemed vast. The light had gone out of their eyes. This was the picture of two people who had lost their way, who had forgotten how to speak to each other, how to see each other. This was the beginning of the end. He closed the album, his hands trembling slightly. The whiskey wasn't working. It wasn't dulling the pain. It was sharpening it, bringing every mistake, every cruel word, every selfish act into painful, high-definition focus. He thought of the baby, his child. A daughter, they had learned at the 20-week scan. He had been in a meeting in Tokyo when Eleanor had called to tell him. He'd been distracted, annoyed by the interruption. He'd offered a perfunctory, "That's nice," before steering the conversation back to his impending divorce settlement. The memory made him sick to his stomach. The steady thump, thump, thump of the fetal heart monitor was seared into his brain. It was the sound of a life that was coming, whether he was ready for it or not. A life that deserved a father. Not a financial benefactor. Not a monster. He walked to the window and looked down at the city. It was his kingdom, a city he had conquered. But he had lost the only thing that had ever made him feel like a man, instead of a machine. He had burned down his own house, and now he was standing in the ashes, choking on the smoke. For the first time in a very long time, Richard Davenport didn't have a plan. He was lost, and as the first light of dawn began to break over the East River, he understood, with a terrifying clarity, that the only person who could save him from himself was the one person he had no right to ask. Isabella Rossi sat in her pristine, white-on-white apartment in Soho, a glass of Prosecco sweating onto the marble coaster beside her. The sun was setting, casting long, dramatic shadows across the room, but she hadn't bothered to turn on the lights. She was staring at her phone, at the gossip blogs that were already feasting on the carcass of her evening. "Billionaire's dinner date disaster," screamed one headline, accompanied by a blurry photo of Richard kneeling beside Eleanor, Isabella hovering in the background like a designer-clad vulture. Sources say the woman was Davenport's recently divorced and very pregnant ex-wife. Each word was a fresh humiliation. She had worked so hard to curate her image, to transform herself from a girl from Queens with a scholarship to NYU into a fixture of the Manhattan social scene. She was an influencer, a brand ambassador, a curator of bespoke lifestyle experiences, a title she had invented herself. Her entire life was a carefully constructed narrative of effortless glamour, and Richard Davenport had been her golden ticket, the final, essential element to secure her place in the stratosphere. And now, in the space of a single disastrous meal, it had all blown up. Her phone buzzed. It was her publicist, a piranha of a woman named Kelly. Isabella let it go to voicemail for the 5th time. She knew what Kelly would say. "This is a PR nightmare. We need to get ahead of the narrative. Are you the home wrecker or the wronged woman? We need to pick a lane, fast." But Isabella couldn't think about the narrative. She was too consumed by a raw, seething fury. Not just at Richard for his callous dismissal, but at the pregnant woman who had dared to shatter her perfect evening. The sheer audacity of it. To show up at Aurelia, of all places, looking like that. It was an act of aggression, a deliberate sabotage. She took a long, angry swallow of Prosecco. She had known about the ex-wife, of course. Richard had been vague, dismissive. It was a business arrangement that ran its course, he'd said, and she hadn't pressed for details. She had assumed Eleanor was some drab, older woman who had been quietly pensioned off, living out her days in a sensible suburb. She had never imagined this. A beautiful, pregnant, and clearly not over it ex-wife who was willing to make a scene. The truth, the ugly, inconvenient truth, was that Isabella had been so dazzled by the price of admission that she had never bothered to read the fine print. The private jets, the front-row seats at Fashion Week, the casual, jaw-dropping gifts like the diamond necklace she was still wearing. She had seen it all as her due, a reward for her beauty and her charm. She had believed she was different from the other girls who attached themselves to men like Richard. She had believed she was smarter. She had met him at a charity auction in the Hamptons. She had been there with another man, a tech bro who had made a fortune in crypto and had the personality of a stale cracker. Richard had approached her, his presence so powerful it seemed to suck the air out of the room. He hadn't flirted or flattered. He had simply looked at her, a long, appraising look, and said, "You're wasting your time with him." 2 days later, a black car was sent to her apartment, and she had stepped into Richard's world. She had known the rules of the game. She was the distraction, the arm candy, the beautiful thing that proved he was still vital, still powerful. In return, he gave her access, a lifestyle she could have only dreamed of. It was a transaction, and she had been a willing participant. But she had made a critical mistake. She had started to believe her own hype. She had started to imagine a future. She had seen herself as the next Mrs. Davenport. The thought was so ludicrous now it made her want to laugh or scream. Mrs. Davenport was on Medicaid and still had the power to bring a man like Richard to his knees. What power did Isabella have? Her beauty, her 2.3 million Instagram followers. It was all ephemeral, a currency that was constantly being devalued by time and the arrival of the next pretty face. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was her mother. Isabella's finger hovered over the ignore button, but then, with a sigh of resignation, she answered. "Isabella, cara mia," her mother's voice, thick with a Queen's accent she had never managed to lose, crackled down the line. "I saw the pictures online. Are you okay? Who was that woman?" "I'm fine, Ma," Isabella said, her voice tight. "It was nothing, a misunderstanding." She looked pregnant, Izzy. "They're saying it's his ex-wife. Is that true?" "I don't want to talk about it." "You need to be careful with a man like that," her mother warned, her tone shifting from concerned to cautionary. "These rich men, they have complicated lives. They have history. You're a good girl, Izzy. You deserve someone who will treat you right, not someone with so much baggage." Baggage. That was one word for it. A pregnant ex-wife collapsing in a 5-star restaurant was more like a shipping container full of emotional wreckage. "I know what I'm doing, Ma," Isabella said, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. After she hung up, she walked over to the window and looked out at the city lights. She had come so far from the small, cramped apartment in Astoria, where she had grown up, dreaming of a life like this. She had fought and scraped and molded herself into a woman who belonged in these rooms, at these tables. But she had forgotten the most important rule. In a world of power and old money, she would always be an outsider. She was a guest, and her invitation could be revoked at any moment, Richard had revoked it with two cold, dismissive words. "Leave now." He hadn't even looked at her when he'd said it. His attention, his concern, his entire being had been focused on the woman on the floor. In that moment, Isabella had understood her true place in his world. She was disposable. She unclasped the diamond necklace. The stones felt cold and heavy in her hand. They weren't a gift. They were a payment for services rendered. She walked into her bedroom and opened a velvet-lined jewelry box. It was filled with similar payments: diamond earrings, a Cartier watch, a sapphire bracelet. The gilded cage had been comfortable, but it was a cage nonetheless. She dropped the necklace into the box and closed the lid. The fury was beginning to subside, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. Kelly was right. She needed to pick a lane, but it wouldn't be the homewrecker or the wronged woman. It would be something else, entirely. She picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts, past the agents, the designers, the so-called friends. She stopped at a name she hadn't called in years. A journalist, a real one, who wrote for New York Magazine. A woman who had once wanted to do a profile on her, before she had become Richard Davenport's mistress. Isabella had turned her down then, wanting to control her own narrative. Now she was ready to talk. She was going to tell her story. Not the curated, glossy version, but the real one. The story of what it was really like to be a beautiful young woman in a city that worshipped money and power. The story of the price of admission. It wouldn't be Richard's story, or Eleanor's. It would be hers. And for the first time all night, Isabella felt a flicker of something that wasn't anger or humiliation. It felt like power. The Legal Aid Society office in the Bronx was a universe away from Aurelia. The air was stuffy, smelling of old paper and stale coffee. The chairs in the waiting room were mismatched and torn, and the walls were a drab, institutional beige. But for Eleanor Hayes, it felt more like a sanctuary than the Park Avenue penthouse ever had. Here, there was no pretense. There was just need, and the quiet, determined hum of people trying to help. She sat across a cluttered metal desk from a woman named Maria Flores. Maria was in her late 40s, with a no-nonsense haircut, a warm, intelligent face, and eyes that had seen it all. She was a warrior in a cardigan, fighting battles for people who had no one else in their corner. "So," Maria said, tapping a pen on a thick stack of paperwork, "the good news is, you absolutely qualify for Medicaid. We'll get the application expedited because of the pregnancy. The hospital bill from last night will be covered retroactively. You don't have to worry about that." Eleanor felt a wave of relief, so profound it almost made her dizzy. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what I would have done." "It's what we do," Maria said with a small smile. "Now, let's talk about child support. Your ex-husband is Richard Davenport." She said the name without any particular emphasis, but she raised an eyebrow. "He has a legal and financial obligation to his child, a significant one." Eleanor stiffened. "I don't want his money." Maria leaned forward, her expression softening. "I understand. Believe me, I see women in here every day who would rather walk through fire than take another dime from the men who hurt them. But this isn't for you, Eleanor. This is for your daughter. This is about giving her the security she deserves. It's about her future, health care, education, a safe place to live. You can't let your pride or your anger stand in the way of that." Eleanor looked down at her hands, twisting the simple silver ring she had worn on her right hand since the divorce. It had been a gift from her grandmother. It was the only piece of jewelry she hadn't left behind in the penthouse. Maria was right, of course. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about the tiny, fierce life that was growing inside her. A life that deserved more than a mother who was too proud to fight for her. "He'll just see it as another transaction," Eleanor said quietly. "He'll throw money at the problem so he doesn't have to deal with the actual, human part of it. So he doesn't have to be a father." "Maybe," Maria conceded. "But that's his problem, not yours. Our job is to make sure your daughter is provided for. His journey to becoming a father, or not, is his own. You can't control that. You can only control what you do. And what you need to do is let me file this petition." The conversation left Eleanor feeling drained but resolute. She walked out of the office and into the bustling chaos of the Grand Concourse. The city, which had felt so hostile and alienating the night before, now seemed vibrant, alive, filled with people who were just trying to get by. She had spent the last decade in Richard's rarefied world, a world of black cars and private clubs, a world so insulated it might as well have been on another planet. She had forgotten what it was like to be on the ground, to be part of the messy, beautiful, complicated fabric of real life. She took the subway back to the small, one-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn Heights she was subletting from a friend. It was on the top floor of a brownstone, with sloping floors and a view of a neighbor's ailanthus tree. After the cavernous emptiness of the penthouse, the small, cozy space felt like a hug. Her best friend, Chloe, was there, waiting for her with 2 large containers of chicken soup. Chloe was a high school history teacher with a sharp wit and a fiercely loyal heart. She had been Eleanor's rock through the entire, ugly divorce. "How did it go?" Chloe asked, immediately starting to ladle soup into bowls. "It went," Eleanor said, sinking onto the worn floral sofa. "I have a lawyer, or a legal aid advocate. Her name is Maria, and she's terrifyingly competent. I think she might be my new hero." "Good," Chloe said, handing her a steaming bowl. "It's about time you had someone in your corner besides me. Did you talk about him?" Eleanor explained the conversation about child support. "She's right. I know she is. It's just, the thought of being tied to him, even financially, makes my skin crawl." "I get it," Chloe said, sitting beside her. "But Maria's right. This isn't about you versus him anymore. This is about you and this baby. Team Us. And Team Us needs resources. Let him pay. Let him build her a solid gold nursery and fund her college education before she's even born. It's the least that bastard can do." Eleanor managed a small smile. Chloe's pragmatic anger was a better tonic than any therapy. They ate their soup in a comfortable silence, the only sound the gentle ticking of a clock on the mantelpiece. Later that evening, Eleanor sat in the rocking chair she had bought from a second-hand store, her hands resting on her belly. She felt the baby kick, a strong, definitive thump. A little person, making her presence known. Your daughter. The words echoed in her mind. She had spent so many months mourning the loss of her marriage, the loss of the future she had envisioned. She had been so focused on what Richard had taken from her that she hadn't been able to see what she still had. She had her health. She had a child on the way. She had a friend who would bring her soup and tell her hard truths. She had a tiny apartment with a view of a tree. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was her life, and it was real. She thought about Richard, alone in his glass tower. She had once thought his wealth and power made him invincible. Now she saw it for what it was. A cage. A beautiful, gilded cage he had built for himself, lined with loneliness. She almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The road ahead was unpaved. It would be difficult and messy, and there were no guarantees. She would have to fight for her daughter and for herself. She would have to learn to be a mother on her own. But for the first time since Richard had walked out the door, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a very long time. It wasn't happiness. Not yet. But it was something close. It was hope. She closed her eyes, rocking gently, the rhythm of the chair as steady and comforting as a heartbeat. Her heartbeat. Her daughter's heartbeat. Two hearts, beating together, ready to face whatever came next. 3 days after the disaster at Aurelia, Richard Davenport did something he hadn't done in 15 years. He took the subway. He wore a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes and a simple dark jacket, but he still felt conspicuous, a wolf in sheep's clothing. The screech of the train's wheels, the crush of bodies, the cacophony of a dozen different languages. It was the raw, unfiltered pulse of the city he owned, but did not know. He was on his way to Brooklyn. His driver could have taken him, of course. A black Escalade could have deposited him silently on the curb outside her brownstone. But that felt wrong. It felt like another exertion of power, another reminder of the chasm between their two worlds. If he was going to do this, he had to do it on her terms. He had to walk on the same ground she walked on. He had gotten her address from the HR department, a breach of privacy that was just one of the 1,000 small, unethical acts he could perform with a single phone call. The knowledge of it sat like a stone in his gut. He found the brownstone on a quiet, tree-lined street. It was charming, in a way that he had once appreciated, but had long since lost the ability to see. He climbed the front steps, his heart pounding a nervous, unfamiliar rhythm. He was about to press the buzzer for her apartment when the front door opened. Eleanor stood there, a canvas tote bag filled with groceries slung over her shoulder. She was wearing overalls, a soft grey t-shirt underneath that stretched over her belly. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her face was free of makeup. She looked tired, but she looked beautiful. More beautiful than Isabella had ever looked in her couture gowns and perfect makeup. She stopped dead when she saw him. Her eyes widened in shock, then narrowed in suspicion. "Richard, what are you doing here?" He had rehearsed a dozen speeches in his head, but now, faced with the reality of her, they all evaporated. "I came to see you. To talk." "We talked. In the hospital," she said, her hand instinctively going to her belly. "I believe I told you to leave me alone." "I know. But He fumbled in his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. It was thick from his personal bank account. "I brought this." She stared at the envelope, then back at his face, her expression unreadable. "What is it?" "It's a check," he said, his voice sounding lame even to his own ears. "For you. For the baby. For whatever you need. Health insurance, a new apartment, anything. It's enough to..." "Enough to what?" She cut him off, her voice dangerously quiet. "Enough to buy your way out of this? Enough to soothe your guilty conscience so you can go back to your penthouse and your 24-year-old girlfriends and pretend none of this ever happened?" "No," he insisted, though he knew that's exactly what it looked like. "That's not it. I want to help." "You want to help?" She let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You want to help now? Where was this desire to help when you were kicking me out of our home? Where was it when you were leaving me uninsured? You don't want to help, Richard. You want to control. You want to write a check and feel like you've done your part, so you can wash your hands of the messy reality of having a child." She was right. He knew she was right. This gesture, which had felt so significant, so generous when he'd conceived of it in the sterile quiet of his office, felt cheap and insulting out here on this sunny Brooklyn stoop. "That's not true," he tried again, his voice lacking conviction. "Isn't it?" She took a step closer, and he could smell the faint, clean scent of her skin. "Let me tell you what I need, Richard. I need a father for my daughter. Not a benefactor, not a trust fund. A father. Someone who will be there. Someone who will show up. Someone who will read her bedtime stories and teach her how to ride a bike and hold her when she's sick. Can you write a check for that?" He had no answer. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken history and unhealed wounds. "I didn't think so," she said softly. She looked down at the envelope in his hand. "I don't want your money, Richard. I told you that. I have a lawyer. We will be filing for child support through the proper legal channels. It will be official, and it will be for her, not for me. And that is the only financial transaction we will be having." She adjusted the grocery bag on her shoulder. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to put my groceries away. This baby seems to be craving pickles and ice cream, and I've learned not to argue." She moved to step around him, to go into the building. But he couldn't let it end like this. "Wait," he said, his voice raw. "Please!" She stopped, her back to him. "You're right," he said, the admission a painful, necessary surrender. "You're right about all of it. The check, it was a stupid, useless gesture. I don't know what I'm doing, Ellie. I've spent my whole life building things, buying things, controlling things. I don't know how to be what you need. What she needs." He looked at the envelope in his hand, a symbol of his own emotional bankruptcy. "But I want to learn," he whispered, the words so quiet he wasn't sure if she had heard them. "I want to try." Eleanor stood motionless for a long time. The sounds of the city seemed to fade away. A breeze rustled the leaves of the trees overhead. Finally, she turned around. Her expression was no longer angry. It was just weary. "Trying doesn't mean showing up on my doorstep with a check, Richard. It means doing the work. The hard, ugly, internal work. It means figuring out why you are the man you are, and then deciding if you want to be someone different." She looked him straight in the eye. "If you ever figure that out, you know where to find me. The court will provide you with my contact information for visitation schedules." And with that, she turned, walked into the building, and closed the door behind her, leaving him alone on the steps. He stood there for a long time, the envelope still in his hand. He felt like a fool. He had come here with a grand, empty gesture, and she had met him with a hard, simple truth. He couldn't buy his way back into her life, or into the life of his daughter. There was no price of admission. There was only the long, unpaved road of redemption, and he would have to walk it alone. He looked at the check one last time, then tore the envelope in half, and then in half again, the pieces fluttering from his fingers into a nearby trash can. It was a useless gesture, but it was a start. The fallout from the incident at Aurelia was not immediate. It was a slow-moving infection that began in the gossip columns and gradually seeped into the more respectable pages of the financial press. At first, it was just whispers, anecdotes shared over cocktails at the New York Athletic Club or on the 18th hole at the Shinnecock Hills Golf Club. "Did you hear about Davenport? Ghastly business." Richard had always believed his personal life was his own, shielded from his professional world by the sheer, unbreachable wall of his success. He was wrong. In the modern world, where every CEO was a brand, and every brand was subject to public scrutiny, character was a commodity, and his had just been severely devalued. The first concrete sign of trouble came a week after his disastrous visit to Brooklyn. He was in a board meeting, presenting a proposal for a hostile takeover of a smaller, innovative tech firm. It was a classic Davenport move, aggressive, audacious, and brutally effective. He had the votes lined up, the financing secured. It should have been a slam dunk. But then, Helen Gable, a board member in her late 60s with a reputation for sharp questions and an even sharper moral compass, cleared her throat. "Richard," she began, her voice calm but firm. "This is an aggressive strategy. It will be painted in the press as a classic David and Goliath story. The narrative will be crucial." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the room. "And frankly, given the recent publicity surrounding your personal life, I have concerns about you being the face of this acquisition. The optics are not good." The air in the boardroom went still. No one had ever dared to connect his personal life to his professional judgment in such a public forum. Richard felt a hot flush of anger creep up his neck. "My personal life has no bearing on my ability to execute this deal, Helen," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Doesn't it?" she countered, unintimidated. "We're not just buying a company, Richard. We're selling a story to the shareholders, to the public. The story of a strong, stable leadership team making a smart, strategic move. A story about a pregnant woman being left uninsured and collapsing in a restaurant while her ex-husband dines with his new girlfriend is not the story we want to be telling." A murmur went around the table. She had given voice to what they were all thinking. The whispers had become a legitimate business concern. He had become a liability. He lost the vote. Not by a wide margin, but he lost. It was his first major defeat in the boardroom in over a decade. He walked out of the meeting in a state of cold fury, the sympathetic, pitying looks from his colleagues more galling than any open criticism. The next blow came a few days later in the form of an article in New York Magazine. It was the profile Isabella had commissioned. But it wasn't the fawning, self-serving piece he had expected. It was a sharp, insightful, and deeply critical look at the transactional nature of relationships in the world of the ultra-wealthy, with Isabella portrayed not as a victim, but as a savvy, if cynical, player in a deeply flawed game. The article didn't mention Richard by name, but it didn't have to. The details were specific enough. The Hamptons charity auction, the emerald silk dress, the diamond necklace, the disastrous dinner. The writer had woven Isabella's story into a larger tapestry of the moral vacuity of his world, and the result was devastating. He was no longer just a philandering husband. He was the embodiment of a corrupt, soulless system. The calls started coming in, from investors, from partners, from the chairman of the board. The questions were couched in polite, corporate language, but the message was clear. Get your house in order. His empire, which had once seemed so solid, so invincible, suddenly felt like a house of cards, trembling in a wind he had created. He had always believed that power was an absolute, that his wealth insulated him from consequences. He was learning, in the most public and humiliating way possible, that the only thing his wealth insulated him from was reality. He found himself working late, not out of ambition, but out of a need to hide. The office, once a stage for his power, was now a refuge from his life. He would sit in his corner office, 50 floors above the city, and stare out at the lights, feeling a profound and terrifying sense of dislocation. He had built all of this, but none of it felt like his. One evening his father called. John Davenport was a retired history professor, a quiet, intellectual man from whom Richard had inherited his intelligence, but not his temperament. They had a strained, distant relationship, Richard viewing his father's academic life as a failure of ambition, his father viewing Richard's corporate life as a failure of character. "I saw the article," his father said, without preamble. I'm sure you enjoyed it, Richard retorted, his voice sharp. No, son, I did not, his father said, and the genuine sorrow in his voice caught Richard off guard. I felt a great sadness. For you. For the woman you hurt. For the grandchild I didn't even know I had. Richard was silent. I remember when you were a boy, his father continued, his voice soft with memory. You used to build these incredible cities out of Legos. They were so intricate, so perfectly designed, but you never put any people in them. They were always empty. I feel like you've done the same thing with your life, Richard. You've built this incredible empty city, and you're living in it all alone. The accuracy of the metaphor was like a punch to the gut. He was a boy in a suit, still building empty cities. What do you want from me, Dad? Richard asked, his voice cracking. I want you to come home, his father said. Not to the penthouse, to the real home, the one you grew up in. Your mother and I are here. We want to see you. The invitation was so simple, so unexpected. He hadn't been back to his parents' modest house in suburban Connecticut in years. He had been too busy, too important. I don't know, he said. Just think about it, son, his father said. Sometimes the only way to figure out where you're going is to remember where you came from. After he hung up, Richard swiveled his chair to face the window. He looked down at the city, his city, the glittering, empty kingdom he had built. For the first time, he didn't see a symbol of his success. He saw a monument to his loneliness. The house of cards was falling, and he was beginning to realize that the only way to survive was to let it fall. The mediator's office was located in a bland, corporate building in downtown Brooklyn, a deliberate choice of neutral ground. The room was small and airless, furnished with a generic conference table and 4 uncomfortable chairs. It was a space designed for conflict resolution, stripped of all personality, meant to force the people within it to focus on nothing but the issue at hand. The issue at hand was their daughter. Eleanor was already there when Richard arrived. She sat on one side of the table, her lawyer, Maria Flores, beside her. Eleanor's belly was more pronounced now, a firm, proud globe that she rested her hands on protectively. She looked calm, composed, her face set in a neutral expression that gave nothing away. Richard sat opposite her, his own high-priced lawyer, a man named Stephen, beside him. Stephen was a shark, the best divorce and custody lawyer in the city. He had already advised Richard to fight for joint custody, to leverage his financial power, to set up a trust that he would control. Richard had listened to it all and then told him, I'm not here to win, Stephen. I'm here to listen. The mediator, a calm, patient woman named Sarah, began the session. The purpose of this meeting, she said, her voice even, is to establish a preliminary parenting plan, to discuss custody, visitation, and communication with the best interests of the child as our sole focus. Richard braced himself for a fight. He expected Eleanor, with Maria's guidance, to come at him with a list of demands, to use his past behavior as leverage to limit his access to the child. He was prepared to concede everything, but Eleanor spoke first, her voice clear and steady. I want my daughter to know her father, she said, looking directly at Richard, not at the mediator. I don't want her to grow up with a story about a man who abandoned her. I want her to have a relationship with you, a real one. Richard was so taken aback by her directness, by the sheer, unexpected grace of her statement, that he couldn't speak for a moment. She continued, but that relationship has to be earned. It has to be built on trust and consistency. It can't be a weekend fantasy of expensive gifts and trips to Disneyland. It has to be real life. It has to be showing up. Maria Flores slid a document across the table. We've drafted a proposal, she said. It outlines a phased approach to visitation, beginning with supervised visits after the birth, and gradually increasing in duration and frequency as the child grows, contingent upon Mr. Davenport's consistent and positive engagement. Stephen, his lawyer, immediately started to object. "This is highly unorthodox. My client is entitled to—" "Stephen," Richard said, cutting him off. He picked up the document and read it. It was detailed, thoughtful, and incredibly fair. It laid out a path, a clear, structured way for him to become a father. It wasn't a punishment. It was a road map. It was exactly what he had told her he needed, a way to learn. "I agree to this," Richard said, without hesitation. "All of it." Stephen looked at him, aghast. Eleanor and Maria exchanged a surprised glance. "Richard, perhaps we should discuss this privately," Stephen hissed. "There's nothing to discuss," Richard said, his focus entirely on Eleanor. "This is more than fair. It's generous." He looked at her, his heart aching with a mixture of gratitude and shame. "Thank you, Eleanor." A flicker of something, surprise, relief, crossed her face before her neutral mask slipped back into place. "This isn't for you, Richard. It's for her. I know," he said quietly. "But thank you anyway." The rest of the meeting was a blur of legal practicalities. They discussed communication protocols, a dedicated app to avoid personal texts and calls, medical decisions, joint consultation, with Eleanor having the final say for the first year, and financial arrangements, a court-ordered child support payment transferred automatically each month, no more, no less. Through it all, Richard remained quiet, agreeable. He was ceding control, something he had never done in his life. And with each concession, he felt not a loss of power, but a strange sense of liberation. He was letting go of the need to win, to dominate, and in its place, a small, fragile seed of something else was beginning to grow. Humility. When the meeting was over, they all stood up. Stephen was fuming, already planning his appeal strategy in his head. Maria gave Eleanor's shoulder a supportive squeeze. As they were about to leave, Richard spoke again. "Eleanor, wait." She paused at the door. "I went to see my parents," he said. The words came out in a rush before he could stop them. "In Connecticut." She turned, her expression curious. "My dad, he said I've spent my life building empty cities." He looked around the soulless beige room. He was right. I've been living in one for a long time. He took a breath. "I'm selling the penthouse." This time, her surprise was genuine, and it broke through her carefully constructed composure. "You're what?" "And I'm taking a leave of absence from the company," he continued, stepping back. "The board is not happy, but they'll survive." He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture he hadn't made in years. "I'm starting therapy. Next week." He wasn't telling her these things to impress her or to win points. He was telling her because he needed to say them out loud. He needed to make them real. He needed her to know that he had heard her on the steps of her brownstone. He was doing the work. Eleanor stared at him, her stormy eyes searching his. He didn't know what she was looking for, or if she found it. But after a long moment, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "That's good, Richard," she said, her voice softer than it had been all day. "That's a good start." She turned and walked out of the room, Maria following behind her. Richard stood there, the silence of the neutral ground settling around him. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was a beginning. It was the first stone laid on a long, uncertain path. A path that might, if he was lucky, one day lead him back to a life that wasn't empty. The process of dismantling a life, Richard discovered, was far more complicated than building one. Building was about acquisition, about adding layers of wealth and success and prestige. Dismantling was about stripping those layers away, a painful, surgical process of deconstruction that left you raw and exposed. His first act was to put the penthouse on the market. The real estate agent, a woman who had sold him the property years ago, was ecstatic. "We'll get a record price for this, Richard. The provenance alone is a selling point. Just sell it," he'd told her. "I don't care about the price." He moved into a furnished corporate apartment in Battery Park City, a sterile, anonymous space that felt more like a hotel than a home. It was a temporary, transitional space, and that felt right. He was in limbo, a man between two lives. The process of emptying the penthouse was an archaeological dig through the ruins of his marriage. He hired a team of professional movers, but he insisted on supervising them himself. He walked through the cavernous rooms, deciding what to keep, what to sell, what to give away. He found Eleanor's books, hundreds of them, packed away in boxes in the library. He opened one, a worn copy of 100 Years of Solitude, and a plane ticket from their trip to Cartagena fell out. He found her painting easel tucked away in a spare room, covered in a dust sheet. She had been a talented painter in college, but she had given it up, slowly, imperceptibly, as her life had become consumed by his. He had never even noticed. Each object was a fresh accusation, a testament to his casual, self-absorbed neglect. He had the movers deliver all of her things to a high-end storage facility, and he sent the key to her lawyer with a simple note. "These are yours. Do with them what you will." His second act of deconstruction was his leave of absence from Davenport Holdings. The board had fought him, but he had been resolute. He promoted his second-in-command, a sharp, capable woman named Sarah Jenkins, to the position of interim CEO. He knew the company would be in good hands. The truth was, the company didn't need him. It was a machine he had built, and it would run perfectly well without him. The realization was both humbling and liberating. His days, once meticulously scheduled from dawn until midnight with meetings and calls, were now vast, empty stretches of time. He filled them with simple things. He walked for hours along the Hudson River, watching the boats go by. He went to museums, not for the society galas, but for the art. He sat in coffee shops and read the newspaper, from front to back. He was learning to be alone, to be quiet, to simply exist outside the context of his own immense success. The hardest part was the therapy. His therapist, Dr. Evans, was a man in his 50s with a calm, analytical demeanor that reminded Richard uncomfortably of his father. Their first few sessions were a stalemate. Richard, accustomed to being the smartest man in the room, tried to control the narrative, to analyze his own behavior with a cool, detached intelligence. "You talk about your life as if you're a spectator," Dr. Evans observed during their third session. "You describe your actions, your mistakes, but you don't seem to connect with the emotions behind them. Why do you think that is?" "It's more efficient," Richard had replied. "Emotion clouds judgment." "Does it?" Dr. Evans had countered. "Or does it provide essential data? Perhaps the reason you made those mistakes is because you were ignoring the data. Your loneliness, your fear of intimacy, your deep-seated belief that your worth is tied to your success." It was a direct hit. Richard had no response. For the first time in his life, he was in a room with someone whose intelligence he couldn't outmaneuver, because it wasn't an intellectual battle. It was an emotional one, and he had come to it completely unarmed. He started to talk, really talk. He talked about his father, about his constant, unspoken disapproval, and the desperate need for his validation that had driven Richard his entire life. He talked about his mother, about her quiet sadness, and the way she had deferred her own life to her husband's. He talked about Eleanor, about how he had fallen in love with her warmth and her intelligence, and how, over time, he had come to resent those very qualities because they reminded him of his own emotional deficits. He had tried to turn her into an ornament, and when she had refused to be one, he had discarded her. The deconstruction was painful. It was like tearing down a building brick by brick and realizing that the foundations were rotten. But slowly, tentatively, he began to see a path forward. Not a return to the man he had been, but the creation of someone new. He adhered to the parenting plan with a monk-like devotion. He used the co-parenting app to communicate with Eleanor, keeping his messages brief, respectful, and focused solely on the baby. He read every pregnancy update she posted, every article about childbirth and infant care. He bought books on fatherhood and read them with the same intensity he had once reserved for financial reports. He was building a new foundation, not of steel and glass, but of something far more fragile and far more valuable. He was learning to be a man, not a titan. And he was doing it in the quiet, anonymous corners of the city, far from the spotlight he had once craved. He was preparing for the most important role of his life, and he knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that he could not afford to fail. The last few months of Eleanor's pregnancy passed in a strange, quiet rhythm. Autumn bled into winter, the crisp air giving way to the biting cold of a New York January. The city was a whirlwind of holiday parties and frantic energy. But Eleanor's world had become small and focused, centered on the life growing inside her. She had settled into her new reality, with a grace and resilience that surprised even herself. The child support payments from Richard arrived in her bank account each month, a silent, electronic reminder of their strange, new connection. She used the money to rent a slightly larger, two-bedroom apartment in the same Brooklyn neighborhood, one with a small room that she slowly, lovingly transformed into a nursery. She didn't want a solid gold nursery, as Chloe had joked. She wanted a space that was warm and safe and filled with love. She painted the walls a soft, sunny yellow. She assembled a simple white crib herself, the instructions spread out on the floor, her brow furrowed in concentration. She bought a comfortable rocking chair and placed it in the corner, imagining the long, quiet nights she would spend there, holding her daughter. Her friends threw her a baby shower, a cheerful, chaotic affair in Chloe's apartment, filled with laughter and terrible advice and mountains of tiny, adorable clothes. She felt surrounded by a community of women, a support system she had built for herself, and she was profoundly grateful. Her communication with Richard continued through the sterile, impersonal interface of the co-parenting app. It was a strange, disembodied relationship. He would ask polite questions. "How was your doctor's appointment? Do you need anything?" She would provide brief, factual answers. "Everything is fine. The doctor says she's right on track." "I have everything I need, thank you." She knew, from the occasional news reports and from Chloe's gleeful updates, that he had sold the penthouse and taken a leave from his company. She knew he was, in his own way, attempting to change. But she kept a careful distance, guarding her heart, protecting the fragile peace she had built for herself and her daughter. She had given him the roadmap, but she couldn't walk the road for him. One snowy afternoon in late January, a package arrived for her. It was a large, flat box. There was no return address, but she knew it was from him. She opened it cautiously. Inside, nestled in layers of tissue paper, was her old painting easel, and beneath it, a full set of brand-new professional-grade oil paints, brushes, and a stack of fresh canvases. There was a note, a simple handwritten card. It said, "I remember you loved to paint. I hope you'll have time for it again one day." She sat on the floor of her living room, the scent of linseed oil filling the air, and she cried. They were not tears of sadness or anger or even forgiveness. They were tears of a complex, overwhelming emotion she couldn't name. It was the first time he had given her something that wasn't about him, or his guilt, or his money. It was something that was just for her. It was a gesture that said, "I see you. I remember you." She didn't use the paints right away. She set up the easel in a corner of the living room, a silent testament to a part of herself she had forgotten. It was a promise of a future where she could be not just a mother, but also herself. As her due date approached, a new kind of anxiety began to set in. She was not afraid of the birth itself, or of the challenges of single motherhood. She was afraid of the moment she would have to let him in. The moment her daughter would no longer be just hers, but theirs. The moment Richard would step out of the app and into her life, a real, physical presence. The parenting plan they had agreed upon felt like a lifetime ago. It had been a theoretical document. Now, it was about to become real. He would be at the hospital. He would hold their daughter. He would begin his supervised visits. She lay in bed one night, unable to sleep, her hands on her belly, feeling the powerful, restless movements of the child within. She was no longer just a collection of kicks and flutters. She was a person on the verge of arrival. A person who deserved two parents, if they could both be brave enough and strong enough to rise to the occasion. The fragile peace of the last few months was the quiet before the storm. But it was not a storm of destruction she was anticipating. It was the messy, chaotic, beautiful storm of a new life beginning, and a new kind of family being born out of the wreckage of the old one. She was scared. But she was also, finally, ready. The call came at 3:17 a.m. on a cold, clear February morning. Richard was asleep, but not deeply. For the past 2 weeks, he had slept with his phone on the pillow beside him, the ringer on its loudest setting. He answered on the first ring. It was Chloe. "She's in labor," she said, her voice a mixture of excitement and panic. "Her water broke an hour ago. We're at Lenox Hill, room 512. "I'm on my way," he said, already out of bed, pulling on the clothes he had laid out the night before. The taxi ride uptown was a blur. The city was asleep, the streets empty and silent. Richard's heart was pounding, a wild, frantic drumbeat against his ribs. This was it. The final exam. The moment of truth. He had spent the last 9 months deconstructing his life, and the last 3 months trying to build a new one. He had read every book. He had attended every therapy session. He had followed every rule in the parenting plan. But he knew, with a terrifying certainty, that none of it mattered if he failed now. He found the room, his hand trembling as he pushed open the door. The scene inside was calm, focused. Eleanor was in the bed, her face pale with effort, her breath coming in deep, rhythmic waves. Chloe was beside her, holding her hand, murmuring words of encouragement. A nurse was adjusting the fetal monitor. Eleanor looked up as he entered. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw no anger, no resentment. Just a raw, unguarded vulnerability. She gave him a small, tight nod. An acknowledgement. An invitation. He walked over to the other side of the bed, his movements hesitant. "Hi," he said softly. "Hi," she breathed out, a contraction seizing her. She squeezed Chloe's hand, her knuckles white. Richard stood there, feeling large and useless, and utterly in awe of the strength he was witnessing. The hours that followed were a crucible. Time seemed to warp, stretching and compressing. There was pain and effort and exhaustion. There was the steady, reassuring beep of the monitor, The calm, professional voices of the doctors and nurses, Chloe's constant, loving presence, and there was Richard. He did the only thing he could think to do. He stayed. He didn't offer advice. He didn't try to take control. He just stayed. He refilled her water bottle. He fetched cool cloths for her forehead. He listened. When she screamed in pain, he flinched, but he didn't leave. When she cried from exhaustion, he stood his ground. He was a silent, steady presence in the corner of the room, a witness to the miracle and the agony of birth. And then, just as the first pale light of dawn was breaking over the city, it happened. With one final, heroic push, his daughter was born. The doctor lifted her up, a tiny, squirming, red-faced creature, and laid her on Eleanor's chest. The baby let out a thin, reedy cry, a sound that seemed to fill the entire universe. Eleanor was sobbing, tears of joy and relief streaming down her face. She looked down at the tiny person in her arms, her expression one of pure, unadulterated love. Richard felt a crack open in his chest, a profound, seismic shift in the tectonic plates of his soul. He had seen multi-billion-dollar deals close. He had seen skyscrapers rise from the ground. He had never, in his entire life, witnessed anything as powerful or as beautiful as this. After a few moments, Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes shining. "Richard," she whispered, "come and meet your daughter." He moved closer, his legs unsteady. He looked down at the baby. She had a full head of dark hair, and her tiny, perfect fingers were curled into a fist. She was the most exquisite thing he had ever seen. "Do you want to hold her?" Eleanor asked. He nodded, unable to speak. Eleanor, with the nurse's help, carefully transferred the warm, swaddled bundle into his arms. She was so light, so fragile. He held her against his chest, his large hands clumsy and unsure. She settled against him, her crying subsiding, and opened her eyes. They were a deep, dark blue, and they seemed to look right through him, into the very core of his being. In that moment, the last vestiges of the old Richard Davenport, the titan, the predator, the builder of empty cities, crumbled to dust. They were replaced by something new, something terrifying and wonderful. He was a father. He looked over at Eleanor, his own eyes now filled with tears. "She's perfect," he whispered. "I know," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. They stayed like that for a long time, a strange, broken and beautiful new family, huddled together in the dawn light of a sterile hospital room. The road ahead was long and uncertain. There were wounds that had not yet healed and a trust that had not yet been fully rebuilt. But for the first time, there was hope. Real hope. They had a name picked out. Grace. It was Eleanor's choice, and when she had told him, he had agreed immediately. Because he knew, with a certainty that resonated in the deepest part of his soul, that he had been given something he had never earned and had no right to expect. He had been given a second chance. He had been given grace. And he would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of it. Redemption isn't a destination. It's a journey. It's not about grand gestures, but small, quiet acts of showing up. Richard Davenport had it all, and he threw it all away. But in losing everything, he found the one thing he never knew he was searching for: himself. This wasn't a story about a millionaire and his mistress. It was a story about a man who broke and a woman who refused to be broken. It's a story about the power of forgiveness, especially forgiving yourself. And it's a reminder that sometimes the most valuable thing you can build is a bridge back to the people you love. What did you think of Richard's journey? Let us know in the comments below.